Born on May 21, 1864, at the royal castle of Laeken in Belgium, Princess Stephanie Clotilde Louise Hermione Marie Charlotte entered a world defined by opulence, rigid expectations, and silent tragedies. She was the daughter of King Leopold II, one of the most controversial monarchs in European history, and Queen Marie Henriette of Austria. Though born into royalty, Stephanie's childhood was far from idyllic. Her father was cold, domineering, and notorious for his infidelities. He ruled not only Belgium but also held personal dominion over the Congo Free State, where his brutal exploitation led to the suffering and deaths of millions. That same cruelty permeated his household. He showed little affection toward Stephanie or her siblings, placing all his attention and ambition on his only son, Prince Leopold. Her mother, Marie Henriette, isolated and embittered by her husband's callousness, eventually withdrew from public life altogether. The atmosphere at court was emotionally barren, and Stephanie, like many royal daughters of her time, was viewed more as a tool for diplomacy than a child deserving of love. Her education was shallow, designed to prepare her for future marriage rather than independence or critical thinking. She learned court etiquette, needlework, and multiple languages, but remained deeply ignorant of the physical and emotional complexities of adult life, especially matters related to sex and reproduction. By the time she turned 15, Stephanie's future was already being bartered. Her father, always calculating, arranged her marriage to Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth of Austria. At 21, Rudolf was 6 years older than Stephanie and came with troubling whispers. Known for his mood swings, rebellious nature, and deep dissatisfaction with the rigid expectations of the Habsburg court, Rudolf had also begun to develop a reputation for scandal. He frequented brothels and carried on affairs with actresses, women who could never be presented in polite society. Unknown to Stephanie and her guardians, Rudolf had already contracted gonorrhea, an illness that would change Stephanie's life forever. Their engagement was announced in March 1880 after Rudolf visited Brussels and met Stephanie. To outsiders, it seemed a romantic match. He wrote to his mother praising Stephanie's beauty and grace. But the illusion was short-lived. Shortly after, when Stephanie was sent to Vienna to begin preparations for the wedding, it was discovered that she had not yet reached puberty and lacked even the most basic understanding of human biology. Humiliated, she was sent back to Belgium, the marriage postponed until she matured. The incident was a public embarrassment but also a damning indictment of how neglected she had been in her upbringing. Stephanie eventually returned to Vienna and married Rudolf on May 10, 1881, in a grand ceremony held at St. Augustine's Church, attended by the highest echelons of European royalty, including the future King Edward VII of England and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. The event was celebrated across the continent. For a brief time, Stephanie felt the enchantment of fairy tale promises. As crown princess, she was embraced by the Habsburg court, and despite her youth, she conducted herself with dignity. Rudolf appeared doting, and their union bore fruit when Stephanie gave birth to their only child, Archduchess Elizabeth Marie, in 1883. But behind the scenes, the marriage was unraveling. Rudolf's erratic behavior worsened, and he resumed his sexual escapades almost immediately after the birth of their daughter. He pursued affairs with multiple women, including sex workers, with complete disregard for the risk he posed to his wife. Tragically, it was from these affairs that he contracted and later transmitted gonorrhea to Stephanie. In 1886, the infection surfaced with devastating consequences. Stephanie suffered from chronic pelvic inflammation, constant pain, and eventually permanent sterility. In an era before antibiotics, such an illness was nearly impossible to treat effectively. The physical torment was only compounded by emotional devastation. She had been infected by her own husband, the man to whom she had given her youth and trust. For a royal woman, whose primary duty was to produce heirs, the disease rendered her a failure in the eyes of the court. What made it worse was Rudolf's reaction. He blamed her for not producing more children, ignoring the fact that he had caused her infertility. The imperial court, steeped in patriarchal values, sided with the prince. Stephanie was now trapped in a toxic marriage, unable to fulfill her role and publicly humiliated by whispers and speculation. Divorce was briefly considered but deemed unacceptable due to their Catholic faith and dynastic expectations. Isolated and betrayed, Stephanie began to seek companionship elsewhere, eventually engaging in an emotional and possibly physical affair with a Polish count while visiting Galicia. This act of rebellion, minor as it was, scandalized the court far more than Rudolf's repeated transgressions. Rudolf, meanwhile, descended into deeper psychological instability. He increased his alcohol consumption and opium use, and his relationships with women grew darker. He sought validation in fleeting encounters, incapable of addressing the destruction he had caused in his marriage. His depression deepened, and he began to entertain morbid thoughts. The scandal reached its tragic crescendo on January 30, 1889, when Rudolf was found dead alongside his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Vetzera, in the Mayerling hunting lodge. The official verdict was a murder-suicide, but conspiracy theories abounded, ranging from political assassination to occult involvement. For Stephanie, Rudolf's death marked both a release and a new burden. At only 24, she was now a widow, her royal career effectively over, and her reputation permanently tarnished. She lived under the shadow of Mayerling and the blame of a failed marriage, even though the true guilt lay with the man who had destroyed her future. Stephanie's life after Rudolf was marked by struggle and resilience. She withdrew from the public eye, plagued by chronic health issues and a court that never fully forgave her for her infertility. Her only daughter, Elizabeth, grew distant, influenced by the narrative that painted her mother as emotionally cold and politically irrelevant. Despite these hardships, Stephanie eventually found solace in a second marriage. In 1900, she wed Count Elémir Lányay, a Hungarian nobleman, in a union that was morganatic and thus stripped her of her imperial titles. The marriage was one of love rather than politics, and for the first time, Stephanie experienced mutual respect and emotional safety. Yet the scars of her earlier life never fully healed. She remained childless, her body having been irreparably damaged by the disease Rudolf had given her. She suffered from recurring pain and fatigue, a constant reminder of the infection that had stolen her reproductive health and her social standing. In addition to her physical suffering, Stephanie had to endure the cultural weight of societal blame. Women of her era were judged almost entirely by their ability to bear children, and infertility was often viewed not as a medical consequence, but as a moral failing. Few acknowledged that the real culprit was the sexually transmitted infection she had contracted through no fault of her own. Even fewer dared to suggest that the root cause lay in the unchallenged sexual privilege of aristocratic men who treated fidelity as optional and disease transmission as inconsequential. Stephanie's case was tragically common. Throughout 19th century Europe, royal and noble women suffered similar fates. Husbands contracted diseases through extramarital affairs and infected their wives, who were then shamed for not producing heirs. The silence surrounding these diseases was deafening. Medical professionals were often complicit, either by covering up diagnoses or failing to properly inform the women affected. The culture of secrecy ensured that such tragedies remained hidden beneath the glittering surface of royal life. Stephanie's story, when examined fully, reveals the broader systemic abuses faced by women in her class and era. She was denied agency from a young age, married off without knowledge or consent, exposed to medical harm by her own husband, and then blamed for the consequences. Her life is a case study in the convergence of patriarchal control, medical ignorance, and social injustice. Even her later years, lived in relative peace with Count Lányay, could not erase the legacy of trauma inflicted upon her in the prime of her life. Her marriage may have been one of the most publicly celebrated unions of her generation, but beneath the pomp and circumstance lay a tragedy that would haunt her for decades. Stephanie died on August 23, 1945, at the age of 81, having lived through the fall of empires and the devastation of two world wars. She outlived both her father, Leopold II, and her husband, Rudolf, as well as the very imperial system that had once demanded her obedience and silence. Her death marked the end of a long and painful journey that began in a gilded cage and ended in quiet obscurity. Yet her story deserves remembrance, not for the scandal but for the profound lessons it offers. It exposes how societal structures allowed male privilege to manifest as both sexual recklessness and medical negligence, with royal women paying the ultimate price. Stephanie's life invites reflection on how knowledge was withheld from women to keep them compliant, how diseases were used as silent weapons, and how history often glossed over the everyday tragedies in favor of grand narratives. Her experience shows that some of the darkest royal scandals weren't dramatic assassinations or political intrigues but mundane, systematic abuses that destroyed lives quietly. Modern audiences may find it hard to grasp the depth of Stephanie's suffering, but her story remains shockingly relevant. In many parts of the world, women still face medical neglect, patriarchal blame, and a lack of autonomy in reproductive matters. Her life is not merely a relic of the past. It is a mirror reflecting ongoing struggles for justice and equality. Princess Stephanie of Belgium was not merely a victim of circumstance. She was a victim of a deeply entrenched system that prioritized male power over female well-being, silence over truth, and reputation over compassion. Her voice was muted in her lifetime, but the truth of her experience now stands as a testament to the resilience of women forced to endure unbearable burdens. In the end, the infected princess symbolizes far more than a tragic medical case. She represents the countless women in history who bore pain in silence, blamed for their suffering, forgotten by time, but whose stories, when finally told, hold the power to challenge injustice and rewrite narratives long dominated by the privileged and the powerful.